Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It is May 29th, 2024, and this is Queer Voices in American Music, how gay composers created America's sound during the most homophobic period in U.S. history with Nadine Hubbs. I'm going to introduce our speaker in a moment, but before we get into the program properly, we're just going to take a moment to remember that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we're committed to helping provide education about that history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. One example of those partnerships is our current exhibit, Music in Maine, which includes a lot of Wabanaki artists and some great selections of Wabanaki music. And that exhibit is it has opened earlier this spring, and it's going to be up through the end of the year through December 31st. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, I hope that you can come to MHS in person soon and check that out. And tonight's program is part of the programming for that exhibit. So Nadine Hubbs is joining us this evening. She is a musicologist, historian, and theorist of popular and classical music and society. Her writings include essays ranging from Leonard Bernstein to queer disco to Taylor Swift and to award-winning books, The Queer Composition of America's Sound and Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music. Her public-facing work has featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, NPR, BBC, and many other outlets, including the Dolly Parton's America podcast. She is a professor of women's and gender studies and music at the University of Michigan. Nadine, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And thank all of you for being here. I'm sure you'll let me know if I have any technical difficulties, and so I will just charge right in and interrupt me if you need to.
Go for it.
So I'm talking this evening about how gay composers managed to create America's sound during the most homophobic period in U.S. history. And I sent an abstract, which I will read just to set this up. America ushered in 20th century modernity with new technologies, aesthetics, and national status as a global power. With the rise in economic and political standing at the beginning of the 20th century came new cultural pressures, too. American concert music, classical music, was deemed far behind its European counterparts and in urgent need of catching up. Years of searching failed to identify a representative compositional voice. Then, in 1939, came the sensational New York premiere of Aaron Copland's cowboy ballet, Billy the Kid, which was soon followed by his Rodeo, Appalachian Spring, and other megahits. So America found its national sound in the music of Copland, a gay, Jewish Brooklynite, and one of a close-knit group of gay composers who crucially influenced and collaborated with each other. So the question that I will be addressing with this talk is, how did a circle of gay composers become architects of American national identity during the most homophobic period in U.S. history? That is, the middle third of the 20th century. And I want to start by, I don't know what's going on with that. I want to start by giving you a sense of what I mean by America's sound. I'm going to play a few snippets of music now that I think you may recognize, at least some of them, maybe all of them. Another snippet, famous, oh dear. I don't know what's going on with this, but let's try again. Another very famous work. Having heard some examples of what I mean by America's sound, now I want to set up the social and cultural context a little bit for American music in the 20th century when it finally found its national voice. Over here on the left side of this slide, I've got modernity and some of the elements of modernity, the innovations, technological advances that were really loomed large in American life at this point. Movies, the moving pictures, US industry and wealth, as I mentioned earlier, the phonograph, then radio would become a big thing. American jazz was huge, not just in the United States, but all over the globe. And of course, after 1918, there was victory in World War I, and the United States was part of the Allies who were victorious. All of that was important in positioning the United States as it became positioned at this time. Some tensions over on this side of the slide. Neurasthenia was a disease that was often diagnosed at that time. We don't use this term or concept anymore, but with so many people going to work in offices, under electric lights, around machinery, there was anxiety about how that could affect people's strength and well-being. And so other words that were used to describe this what was seen as a condition of 20th century nerve weakening, nervosism, and even Americanitis. And this betrayed some gender anxieties about emasculation, men coming off the farms, going to work in offices. How could we be okay? Then European cultural dominance was a big deal because, as I already mentioned, America was seen as behind. We were now this global power, but we were seen culturally as still a kind of a backwoods, backwater. And old Europe, of course, had great literature and great art and great music, and particularly in music, we were seen as lacking. White supremacy, male supremacy were very determining forces on the scene. And there was this new figure at the beginning of the 20th century, the homosexual. Now, this doesn't mean that people had not found things to do with people of the same sex before this time, but they hadn't been named and labeled by science and medicine until this time. So there was this new persona, the homosexual, and society, middle-class society at least, was wondering, what does that look like? What do we do about this? So by the 1920s, America had still not found its voice. And I want to give you some samples of what musical modernism sounded like from European composers and American composers by the 1920s. Here's the one of the two most important modernist composers, Arnold Schoenberg, the Austrian. The other most important composer was seen as his rival. It was Igor Stravinsky, a Russian-French composer. So here's Schoenberg's music from 1928. Oh, that happened again. Here we go. And Aaron Copland, the American composer, was young at this point. He was 24, 25 years old, and he was writing very much in the mold of Stravinsky, the other great master of the era. And finally, an example from Virgil Thompson. Copland was gaining some fame by this, a little bit of fame by this point. Virgil Thompson was a relative unknown. He wrote this opera in 1927 and 1928, collaborating with the writer Gertrude Stein. And you see it's all African-American singers, dancers, and actors on the stage in 4 saints and 3 acts.
How many saints are there in it? There are very many, many saints in it. There are as many saints as there are in it. There are saints in it. Saint Teresa, Saint Settlement, Saint Ignatius, Saint Lawrence, Saint Pilar, Saint Clare, and Saint Cecilia. How many saints are there in it? There are as many saints as there are saints in it. How many saints are there in it? There are saints in it, Saint Celestine, Saint Lawrence. There are as many saints, there are as many saints, and as many, many saints as there are in it. Thank you very much.
So that excerpt certainly sounds very different from the other two brands of modernism, the Schoenberg and the Copland. Thompson was a young man himself, about 30 years old at that time. He was swimming against the current of musical modernism. Already in 1927, he was, and now 10 years later, here's another example. Thompson writing in the same style in his American ballet, the first American ballet. No one had imagined the possibility that there could be an American ballet. And he chose the subject of the filling station for his ballet. If you notice details, I will play this example and discuss some of the details that you can see even in this photo. A little excerpt from Mac's Dance from Virgil Thompson's 1937 ballet, Filling Station. If you heard a little quote there, you might have recognized a tiny bit of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, just where I cut the excerpt. You might also notice, if you've been looking at this photograph, he looks like a gas station attendant, the dancer and choreographer Lou Christensen, but if he's wearing a Dickies sort of uniform, it's Dickies with a difference. You notice the little bow tie, but a see-through shirt. His nipple is visible. Let me get that thing. He's wearing some gold lame on the uniform. It's really campy opera. In terms of the subject, a ballet at the filling station, which is very modern, right? Filling stations were pretty new. The theme, the costume, this is all campy. And Virgil Thompson, the composer, was known in the terms of that time. We wouldn't use this word now. He was known as a pansy. That is, he was not a butch or conventionally masculine gay man. Whenever he opened his mouth, people immediately heard him as gay, and as often would label him as a queen. He was, if you think of, say, RuPaul, he was one of those queens who was just brilliant. He was campy, and he was very gutsy, because here he was writing pretty music, transparent texture, and tonal music in this modernist moment. This bold impudence of his was innovative, and it was specifically queer genius. Now, Copland and Thompson knew each other by this time. Copland admittedly had his mind blown by this work. He was influenced by it. He took inspiration from it. And he immediately started to write his own American opera, which he called Billy the Kid, again, on an American, distinctly American theme. And he said, I never dreamed that there could be such a thing as an American opera. And I'm not going to play an example of this, but the sound of the music was not like that earlier Copland excerpt, that Stravinskyan sound. It was very much like Virgil Thompson. The sound that we heard in Filling Station, this tonal Americana, it came to be called. Copland, unlike Thompson, skyrocketed immediately to fame. You see that on stage, things were not campy. So I didn't play any of Copland's ballet, but I will play again Hoedown from Rodeo, another cowboy theme that he visited a few years later. Right. So that's a really famous piece. If some of you know the American Beef Council commercial, beef, it's what's for dinner. And that's the tune that goes with it. So many of us have heard of Copland. We've heard Copland's music, even if we didn't know that it was his music. He became the most famous composer in America and in American history. And he's still incredibly famous and influential and often heard. But as I showed, he was inspired by Thompson, who is not by any means a household name. And I've started to map a queer lineage of what I'm calling America's sound. So Copland, who is the most famous exponent of that Americana idiom in his iconic works like Appalachian Spring, Fanfare for the Common Man, learned how to be Copland from Virgil Thompson. Remember, not only did he compose his first Americana work, his Billy the Kid ballet in 1938, just after Thompson's ballet Filling Station, but it was also a whole decade after Thompson had written Four Saints in Three Acts, which first establishes this sound, this voice. Now, in this photo, you see Thompson and Copland around 1950, and they were in Virgil Thompson's apartment at the Chelsea Hotel in New York City. Also pictured there are two colleagues. Samuel Barber and Giancarlo Menotti, two composer colleagues, they were life partners, also American composers. I am showing an arrow of Thompson's influence to Copland. Here, even before that, though, Thompson himself was inspired in his innovations by the American lesbian writer Gertrude Stein. When he was at Harvard as a student, he read her work and he followed her modern creative methods. First of all, she used everyday American vernacular language, and he did that musically. He also followed her in her creative method of automatic writing, spontaneity. And after he finished at Harvard, he moved to Paris and sought out Gertrude Stein, went and introduced himself, brought her flowers, and very soon they began working together, collaborating on that opera, Four Saints and Three Acts. It was the first of two important modernist American operas that they wrote together. Now, once Copland did become the most successful composer in America, jealousy and rumors grew up around him. It's not surprising. But in his case, the jealousy and rumors were inflected with homophobia. Here you see Edgar Varese railing against what he called Copland's competing boyfriends in a letter to his friend, the Vermont composer, Carl Ruggles. And Varese insults Copland in sexual terms, obviously, using phobic imagery. So what you see here is the implication that if Aaron Copland was queer, then his success was corrupt and dirty. So what would have been support in other contexts, like Edgar Varese and Carl Ruggles, maybe helping each other out, getting each other performances, that would be support, but in this queer context, it was seen as pulling strings because gay people were involved. What would be called, in another context, just connecting here was seen as conspiring. Therefore, what we're seeing is that the notion of a gay social network or professional network was inevitably tainted. It was evidence of a sinister homosexual mafia in the composition world. There was no concept that would have allowed even a neutral spin, let alone a positive spin. Therefore, for years, decades, the only people who would speak of the close connections in this composer circle were their enemies. So the straight composer's anxiety, they had a reason to be anxious. Even a grade school kid in the early 20th century knew that being a composer was problematic for a boy. Here's Samuel Barber as an 8 or 9-year-old kid writing a really heartfelt letter to his mother and leaving it on her dressing table, saying, "Mother, I'm really sorry, but I have to tell you my worrying secret. Please don't cry, but I'm going to be a composer." I was not meant to be an athlete. So he already understands at age 9 the opposition, the contrast between an athlete, an all-American athlete, and a composer. And then he says, "Please, don't ask me to try to forget this unpleasant thing and go play football. Sometimes I've been worrying about it so much it makes me mad." Not very. And he did become a composer, and a very important American composer, and also a gay composer. Paul Bowles, another member of the circle I'm discussing here, in World War II, he showed up to the draft board. Army psychologists asked him, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "I write classical music." They said, "What do you mean, like symphonies and stuff?" He said, "Yeah, exactly." They dismissed him. They classified him, the Army classified him as 4F, that is psychologically unfit, because he told them he wrote symphonies. So within this context, social, musical, gender, and sexual context, the composers of this circle that I'm looking at forged a musical style that resonated with certain aesthetic and identity positions in that era, that homophobic and masculinist era. And these meanings that I've mapped out on the slide resonated, at least for insiders in the music world. That is, the manly style of composition was dissonant and noisy and clanging. Virgil Thompson and his circle composed consonant music. The manly position was atonality in this time. They composed, like you heard in Schoenberg, they composed tonal music. Also, as you heard in Schoenberg, stylistic complexity was manly. They deliberately cultivated simplicity and transparency. Germanness, musical Germanness, was the stance of Schoenberg and other manly complex composers. They instead deliberately wrote music that sounded French. Masculine boldness contrasted with feminine gentleness as it was heard in the music, and then heterosexuality ultimately was encoded against the encoding of homosexuality in the sound, in the style of these gay composers' music. So you may not know what I mean when I talk about the music being French or the music being German. But this identification was central to these gay composers. And I want to give you a particularly clear example, strong example by Paul Bowles of just how Frenchness was understood. So here's the full circle of gay composers I studied in my book. We've talked about Thompson and Copland. We've talked a bit about Bowles and Bernstein. We also have David Diamond and Mark Blitzstein and Ned Rorem in this circle. The elders of the circle were Virgil Thompson and Aaron Copland. And the younger members, to some extent, followed in their footsteps. They helped each other out in various ways. I have a piano, I'm going to be leaving my apartment for the weekend. You have a composing deadline. Here are the keys to my apartment, et cetera, et cetera. Or I do some conducting. You have a new piece. I will program it and give you a premiere. The elders taught the younger ones compositional skills. The younger ones did assistantship kinds of jobs, music copying and so on for pay for the older ones. And so there were all kinds of connections here among these composers. And though I said you would have to be an enemy in past years to acknowledge that they were tight, they were thick as thieves, they were. And not just on a single level. I want to show you here the connections among the 7 composers. First of all, musical connections. They all had various musical connections. Paul Bowles studied orchestration with Aaron Copland. You see that Bernstein and Blitzstein worked together. Bernstein composed some of Blitzstein's music, or I'm sorry, conducted some of his premieres. He also conducted premieres for others in this circle. David Diamond needed money, and Bernstein got him a gig as a fiddle player in the pit of his Broadway musical, et cetera, et cetera. Virgil Thompson had Ned Rorem as a very young man copying his music every day for pay. Those are musical connections, and they were influenced by each other's style. Social connections shows the friendships. They all knew each other. Every one of them knew each other. Some of them were quite close. And one more color orange shows sexual connections, either successful or spurned. For example, Virgil Thompson, a much older man, made a pass at Ned Rorem, who was famously beautiful as a young man. Ned Rorem pretended to be sleeping. But on the other hand, Ned Rorem and Leonard Bernstein, the first time they met in their 20s, they hooked up. That was the only time they did. So if you put all of these together, you see how thick and dense the relations were and multidimensional. Does that mean that Varese was right? That Copland was only famous and successful because of his filthy sexual favors traded? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that Varese was utterly steeped in the homophobia of the day. So, you know, eroticism energized the artistic circle. All of these various kinds of relations were part of the energy and the creativity of the circle's activities. And I come back now in closing to my original question: how did this circle of gay composers become architects of American national identity during the most homophobic period in US history? You may have some ideas about that by now, but I'll tell you what my analysis of it in my book, The Queer Composition of America's Sound, has been. First of all, as Varese knew, even if he couldn't understand it correctly, homosexuality in this period was not just a sexual phenomenon, it was also a social phenomenon. It was both social and sexual. How was it social? Social marginalization of homosexuals meant that middle-class homosexuals maintained a discrete profile. They were out to their queer friends and usually almost no one else. Out in the non-queer world, they had to maintain appearances and attempt really seriously to pass, and the punishments, if you didn't, could be quite severe. So how this circle of gay composers became architects of the national identity in this time: these composers, first of all, they were hardworking and they were talented. We have to acknowledge that. We also have to acknowledge that they were all white and male in a time when both of these identities were essential to compositional success. Then, as I've been saying, they mutually influenced and often supported each other. They also had rivalries that inspired one another. And finally, and this is the part you might not expect, they managed to succeed because they were a close-knit circle and an interdependent group because of homophobia. Because homophobia forced queer people to be a close-knit community in that time and to trust, in many ways, only each other. So this, in my reading, is how this circle managed to become architects of American national identity during the most homophobic period in US history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadine. Really, really interesting stuff, and just really kind of fascinating how, I mean, this community, and when we think of like a distinctly American sound or distinctly American compositions, musicals, operas, these are the composers and these are the pieces that come to mind. Just interesting how, what a, really like a closeted community that they had to live in. Can you tell me, and folks in our audience, please feel free to type questions into the chat. I'm going to start us off with this question. You talked a lot about how if you were a male and a composer, specifically like a composer of classical music, symphonies, that's not seen as very masculine. But again, I think when we think of like the music of this era, it's guys like Copland, Bernstein, it's men that come to mind. So can you tell us anything about, like, was the expectation that if you are a composer that you're female? Because it doesn't, I'm trying to think of like famous female composers from the era, um, and I'm drawing a blank.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Kathleen. So a New England composer who I haven't mentioned, but who was one of the early American modernists in the first couple decades of the century is Charles Ives. And many of us by now have written our histories of Charles Ives in connection with a great deal of gender anxiety. He grew up with a band director father in the era of John Philip Sousa, and that was sort of all American, but it felt suspect enough to Charles Ives that he seemed to try to compensate. For one thing, he never became only a composer, right? He was an insurance executive in Hartford.
Oh, okay.
Um, always had that full-time career, which was more manly and certainly more lucrative than being a composer. And then in his scores, he would write things like, play this like a man. And he had lots of statements about how is American music ever finally going to stand up and be a man? So there seems a lot of anxiety and
Mm,
overcompensation for the fact that he is a composer. And we notice that stylistically, it's noisy, clangy, atonal, which is not to say that atonal music cannot be beautiful, but in that era, uh, that music wasn't as suspect. It wasn't as suspicious for effeminacy.
sure.
And you ask, does it mean if you're a composer, you're female? No, it might mean you're emasculated or feminine, but if you're female and you're a composer, you're not going to have a big career. You're going to, no matter how good you are, nobody will have heard of you.
Mhm.
So it's not that you're female, but it might be that you're inadequate as a male. And I regard this as a historian as having much to do with how America had a new standing in the world and needed to be strong.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, kind of coming onto the world stage in a very geopolitical way. And then makes sense that we want to do so like in the arts, and other iconic ways too.
Right. We were kind of a backwater in that sense. So we had industry, we had wealth. All those things seem sort of crass by comparison to Europe that also had hundreds of years of highly developed high culture.
Sure.
And
So
notice jazz was the darling of the entire globe at that time, but because it was created by African American uh, artists,
mm,
there was no one saying, "Oh, that could be the representative
sure.
American sound."
Mhm. Mhm. Um Interesting too. So did America not were there no like American composed operas like before the 1930s? Am I understanding that correctly?
No, there were American composed
Okay.
operas before then, but American concert music labored in obscurity.
Okay. So not really becoming known till the 20th century.
No, and American opera companies, say the Metropolitan Opera wanted to compose or wanted to rather program the important classic
Right, right.
uh, um, repertoire, the serious,
Sure.
important works.
So just out of curiosity, those American operas, are they usually in English, or are they done in other languages too?
So the American operas written by Virgil Thompson are not only in English but vernacular, everyday
Mm,
English, like Gertrude Stein's writing was.
mhm,
Copland wrote an opera. Mark Blitzstein wrote sort of operettas. They were all in English and vernacular English.
mhm. Nice.
So that's another thing about these composers as a circle. They were also both classical and very popular at the same time. They were
Mm,
not above writing a radio play,
sure.
writing music for the stage, um, the ballet, and so when Copland was still more under the influence of European values, he was writing concert works, purely instrumental work, not as accessible.
Mhm.
And then when he saw what Thompson did, Thompson was writing for the stage. He had the opera already, Four Saints and Three Acts in 1927. Then he had this outrageous ballet, Filling Station, in 1937. He's writing for the stage. It's more accessible. Audiences can relate. It wasn't being as harsh and severe. And then Copeland took a page from Thompson's book. He wrote for the stage too. He wrote Billy the Kid.
So what about in other, so I know you know a lot too about country music in American history. Do you see um LGBTQ composers in genres like that in this time period? Or again, is it more um Broadway or symphony or classical stuff?
Well, so our sort of when we picture gay music, we might think of Broadway musicals.
Mhm.
Um, to whatever extent we're aware of the gay presence in classical music, we might think of that. We think of disco by now. We think of dance music, electronic music.
Mhm.
Um, we don't tend to think of country music. Um, there so first of all, country music's been around for 100 years, started in the
Mhm.
1920s. In that period, as I said, in relation to these composers, people were not out in public.
Sure.
And so it would be hard for us to, um, we'd have to stumble upon some great archival find to
To really
discover
like identify someone. Yeah, sure.
that Mother Maybelle Carter had a female lover or something, we
Right,
don't know
right. Mhm.
that. Uh, we do know that there were early country songs like the Lavender Cowboy, that country and western, the
Mhm.
cowboy song, the Lavender Cowboy, which is kind of a parody or spoof, that's uh, on a gay theme.
Mhm.
Um, they used lavender in the same understanding that we understand it,
Sure.
um, in the 1930s. And there have been, we know of some say 1960s, 1970s, and later country artists who were queer. Um, Wilma Burgess, who was a Patsy Cline, a friend of Patsy Cline's and a big admirer, and worked with Owen Bradley, the same producer, was a lesbian who opened after her singing career, opened the first lesbian bar in Nashville, and
Oh,
ran
wow.
the bar for a long time and sang there sometimes. She was a PE teacher. Talk about stereotypes. She had gone to college in phys ed. Um, Really great singer in the vein of Patsy Cline. And some more recent country singers like Shelley Wright and TJ Osborne of the Osborne Brothers and Orville Peck are out. Um, we it's interesting not only to look at artists though, but also to look at audiences. And I have
Mhm.
seen from the archives gay newsletters, secret gay newsletters from the Cold War era, where there's a little ad for the local Hank Snow fan club. So certainly queer people have been country fans, have done country dancing in their own spaces
Mhm.
for a long time. And then in the 90s, there was a big queer um, two-step and line dance craze uh, that played out in gay bars and then in non-gay bars that would have like a queer night.
Mhm.
And by now, we have a lot of indie artists in
Mm.
country music who are queer, non-binary.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Again, really interesting talk, really interesting stuff. I'm so glad you could share your time and your expertise with us on this topic. What's next for you? Like anything that you're working on that we should know about?
My current book project,
Yeah.
which is the title is Border Country, Mexico, America, and Country Music. Depending on where people are in the United States, they may not be aware at all that there are a lot of Mexican American country fans. There have been Mexican American country stars. Probably a lot of people have heard of Freddie Fender, Linda Ronstadt, who did rock and country both. But I've been down at the Texas border for my field work, and country is just everywhere
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to seeing that book, and and checking out your other publications too. And folks that are listening, if you haven't yet visited Music in Maine, that's going to be open through December 31st, 2024. So please come to our Portland campus and check that out, and visit mainhistory.org, because we've got a lot of other great music and Maine related programming on the horizon, and you can learn more about it and register for all our great programs there. So again, thank you so much, Nadine, for joining us. Please let us know if you're ever in Maine. We'd love to see you at MHS, and
I'd
good
love.
luck with your work.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. This has been a pleasure.